I'm Ed Adams, and you're listening to the AFCA Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of the AFCA Podcast. And in this episode, we're giving a voice to pioneers in American cinema. I'll break all this down for you after the break. The AFCA Podcast is sponsored by Morgan Stanley Global Sports and Entertainment. When we think of silent film, it's easy to point out the works of Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Erich Von Stroheim, and DW Griffith. Their collective works delighted audiences around the country and helped shape the story and spirit of America. From a white male's point of view, that is.
That's kind of the great thing about this collection and also Pioneers of African American Cinema is it upsets our expectations. We think, women's film, or we think, early black cinema. I know what that's going to be about. Well, you don't.
That right there is director and producer Bret Wood. Bret produced two incredible collections for Kino Classics, Pioneers of African American Cinema and Pioneers, First Women Filmmakers. Each collection contains over 20 hours of rare movies, film clips, interviews, and commentary about the other people who chronicled the history and spirit of America with silent film. So with Black History Month ending and Women's History Month about to begin in March, let's explore the incredible contributions of these diverse innovators. I spoke with Bret Wood recently via Skype about the first collection, Pioneers of African American Cinema. So, Bret, welcome to the AFCA Podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to talk to you.
So, you have two major collections here. One, Pioneers, First Women Filmmakers, and Pioneers of African American Cinema. So, talk to me, how did these projects come about?
Well, I work in film distribution for the past 30 years, actually more than 30 years now. I've been with the company. It's called Kino Lorber. When I first started working there, it was Kino International. But they specialize in foreign films, new independent films, but they've always had a commitment to classic films, specifically silent movies. And so through the years, I've produced lots of classic films, established contacts with the major film archives around the country and even internationally. And at a certain point, this project began with Kickstarter. Someone we know worked at Kickstarter came to us and said, we want to encourage companies to raise money to do film restorations. Is there a dream project you've always wanted to do that you would not be able to do unless you raised a lot of money, to make it possible? And one of the first things that came to mind was a collection devoted to Black filmmakers, especially from the silent era and early sound era. It's something we'd wanted to do, but to do it right, you would need to make it 4 or 5 discs. You would need to have a lot of money to create new scores for the silent movies. It's not the kind of thing that we had deep enough pockets to execute on our own. And so we launched the Kickstarter campaign, got a very enthusiastic response, and that really gave me the freedom to kind of go crazy and create a collection of 5 discs, something like 20 hours of material, shooting interviews with historians, archivists, going to the Library of Congress and shooting footage there, really doing it right. And the collection came out. It got a lot of accolades. It won the Film Heritage Award from the National Society of Film Critics. And so that's how it happened. And then suddenly I became the guy who makes these epic archival, historical box sets.
You're the man,
so a couple of years later, I just sort of back into that position. And but I'm loving it because, we've always put out a lot of silent movies. And, you do them one at a time, or maybe you do 3 or 4. But to really do something this deep, and the reason we felt like we needed to make it so big and so dense was that we really were filling in a chapter of film history that had not properly been told. Like if you get on Amazon and YouTube, you can find a lot of these films, but they're scattered. Mm-hmm. No one has ever really collected them together and, you know, done a really good job of remastering and restoring them, putting them in chronological order, having essays, having interviews, so that we really explain the context and the historical significance. So it's not just the films, it was that whole, this was a chapter of film history. And so that's why it needed to be so big. And that's why it was like a 2-year project from beginning to end to do that.
Okay. So one of the things that you mentioned was about the music. And I was fascinated by that. I mean, these are silent films, and some of these, you have to write original scores for these, correct?
Right. And we wanted to do all new scores because some had been out with other scores, but, you know, we wanted these to be fresh, even if someone might, because some of the films had been released before. So we wanted ours to be the best and to have all new scores. And one of the highlights from Pioneers of African American Cinema is our executive producer of the project, Paul Miller, better known as DJ Spooky, provided scores for a couple of the Oscar Michaud films, Within Our Gates and Body and Soul, right? I think that's the two. Mm-hmm. And he was a strong supporter of the project. He was our spokesperson during the Kickstarter campaign and has been championing these films all along. And since then, he's been performing with Body and Soul and Within Our Gates, you know, around the country at museums and art centers and things like that. So that was a pleasure to be able to collaborate with him and give him a forum to, you know, expand his body of work. I mean, he's probably best known, at least in terms of his film-related work, of doing a thing called Rebirth of a Nation, where he takes DW Griffith's Birth of a Nation and sort of puts a new spin on it by generating a, you know, contemporary score from a Black artist that, you know, it complements the film and sort of helps you question what this film is saying to audiences of, you know, 1915. So, you know, he's a not just a musician, you know, he really gets into the meaning of the films and the history of the films. And so to me, that's probably one of the big highlights of, you know, the African American cinema collection.
Awesome. That is so cool. I mean, I remember watching Rebirth of a Nation years ago, and it was kind of captivating because it is, like you're saying, it is this reinterpretation of this. I don't even know how to explain D.W. Griffith. You love him and kind of hate him at the same time. You know what I mean? So
yeah, and actually we have a weird relationship with D.W. Griffith because, you know, and again, part of our mission is to present film history in a way that we understand it and have access to it. And I actually produced the Blu-ray release of Birth of a Nation, you know, one of the most notorious, most racist films ever made, because we, you know, if you want to talk about it and be able to understand its historical impact, for better or worse, and 90% for worse, you have to see the film. And so we produced that. And what's interesting, last year, when Spike Lee was working on Black Klansman, they contacted us and asked us to use footage from it. And the call came to me, and I said, you know what? You can use the footage. You're not paying for the footage. It's kind of, we're obligated to share this, especially if Spike Lee is using the footage to make a political point. We're in. And, you know, it's sort of our, you know, we want the film to be out there, but we also want to try to let it be used in a way that people understand the, you know, the racist underpinnings of it.
So let's talk about some of the movies that are in the collection. So, I mean,
sure.
you start out with, like Luther Pollard's, his first 3 comedies, including his Keaton Cop, Caper the Reckless Rover. But then we get into Oscar Michaud's first piece, Within Our Gates. So, like, for me, you know, we're used to seeing, like, short comedies like Chaplin or, you know, or Keaton. Yeah. And then you see this, and it's full of drama, and it's about real African American lives.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the earliest surviving feature film by a black filmmaker, but it's not necessarily the first ever made. We think there are others before this that just no longer survive, but this is the earliest one that survives. And it's pretty amazing that he addresses issues of race head on. There's a scene of lynching that's still very troubling to watch today. And what I think is also interesting about Michaud, and I never really understood this seeing the films one at a time, but when you see them back to back, he has a very cynical opinion of religion, or not necessarily religion, but of the church. There are, I can think of at least 4 films where a minister is kind of if not a villain, someone who's sort of morally compromised because he's trying to keep the peace by sort of allowing the African American community to be oppressed. And I don't know where that came from, but it's an interesting side of his work that doesn't get talked about much because you don't really see it until you have all the films gathered together. And and it shows that he had a complicated view of race. And if you don't mind me jumping ahead, there's one film. Oh my gosh, what's it? A Darktown Review, which, if you want to talk about a complicated view of race by Austin Michaud, it's a blackface minstrel comedy short.
Yeah.
And it's like, what in the world is he doing? And I would love to know. I would love to have read an interview with him where he would discuss something like that, why he did it.
Yeah.
All I can speculate is that he's taking this entertainment form which whites created to mock African Americans, and he's sort of taking control of it.
Yeah, it is very cynical. It's a very cynical piece, right? Yeah.
And then what's weird in it is that there's this extended comedy routine of a minister. So again, he brings back this. He sort of makes fun of this minister who's preaching a sermon, which is A B C D E F G H I J K L M N O P. It's a shame that there are no substantial interviews with Michaud to give him a chance to talk about his intentions with a lot of these films. But I think by viewing them together, especially in the context of other black directors, helps us understand a little better. Because if you just saw that one movie by itself, you wouldn't know what to think. It's because it's such a strange thing for a black filmmaker to have made.
Absolutely. I mean, but but Michaud is a pretty interesting character. When you look at his body of film, which you gracefully compiled for us to see all at one time. But but even his own response to Birth of a Nation, with the symbol of the unconquered. Tell us about that.
I mean, it's hard for us today to sort of realize how big an impact the Birth of a Nation had, because it was by far the most successful movie ever made, but it created so much controversy, and it brought about the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. It really galvanized the NAACP and this fight against modern day lynchings. This is in the 1910s. So it was a huge phenomenon, and it must have been horrifying for the black community to see the degree to which this film was being celebrated and how it was just dominating popular culture. And so I think for Michaud to make a film that sort of responds to that shows the KKK in a much more cynical light, is a real act of rebellion. And we're really lucky that this film exists because, he was not a studio. He was a guy who made films, and not very many prints of these films were made. So it's not like a Hollywood movie where they have probably made 100 prints and they're circulating them around the country. They have the negatives stored in a vault. So that film is pretty much guaranteed to survive. Independently made films like this, the negatives are lost. Prints are all over the country. within our gates, I think, showed up. I think it survived in South America somewhere because, like Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, there was a large black community there, and so a lot of films made in America for African American audiences ended up being shown there. They would play around America, and then once they'd sort of played out in America, the print on its last legs would be shipped down to South America to play that market and just allow itself to disintegrate after it had, played so much. But fortunately, that film survived. And
Oh, wow.
so the fact that these films survived is pretty miraculous.
So one of the things I thought was interesting is the decision-making process. Like, as a producer, you're not only just trying to find these archives, but you also have to kind of create this film, which includes the music, which includes, the intertitles, which includes, even decisions of how to restore or what to restore or what not to restore in the film. Can you talk about some of that decision-making process? And specifically, a lot of films that you'll see in both collections are tinted. Yeah. And I was curious about that. Why did you make those decisions?
It used, back when we first started releasing silent movies on video, we would just tint everything and replace the titles and do, we felt like anything was fair game. But as the years have passed, we've sort of gravitated towards a more archival approach, which is if you don't know the color tinting that was in a film originally, then don't just color tint it. You need to either be working from a tinting script, and sometimes they will survive. Sometimes you'll even have etched on the negative of the film, it'll say amber or it'll say blue at the beginning of a sequence. So you'll know, okay, I can tint this section blue. So nowadays, that's the only time we will tint a film, is if we know the color tints which were on it originally. And titles, we try to find the original titles, and if the original titles don't exist, we will try to track down either a script or copyright records so that the intertitles within the film are as accurate as possible. And with the music, we worked with a lot of people who had scored silent films before, and there are people that's all they do, so they are really good about knowing the style of music that would have played in a theater in 1922, for example. But at the same time, we also wanted to mix it up a little bit because we didn't want these collections to be perceived as something you watch in school and kind of dry and academic. So in addition to some of the more traditional scores, we would have more contemporary scores, like I mentioned, the DJ Spooky scores we did for a couple of Michaud films. And one of the things that I was most proud of in this is there's a composer who we worked with named Sam Wayman, who did there's 3 religious films in Pioneers of African American Cinema. I'd love to talk about those in a minute if we have time. But Sam Wayman is someone who was a musician who did a lot of great work in the 70s. He appears in and scores a 1970s film, which I love, which we later put out, called Ganja and Hess, directed by Bill Gunn. And, he had not really been heard from in 20 years or so. I think he will still occasionally play a jazz set in Nyack, New York, where he lives. But this is like an idol of mine, and it was great to have the opportunity to track him down and say, hey, I'm doing this thing. Would you be interested in creating a musical score for a silent movie? What's interesting is that he provided sort of a gospel-y score for these films, which are about the wages of sin. They're sort of religious films. And Sam Wayman, incidentally, is the brother of Nina Simone, and he used to be her band leader back in the, I think, 60s and early 70s.
Oh, wow.
And so the guy is an incredible musician and has incredible stories to tell, and it was just a pleasure to involve him in the project. And speaking of these films, so these are the religious films. The biggest one is called Hellbound Train, and they're significant not only in that they're extremely rare, but we didn't want to just do movies that played in theaters. We wanted to try to get all kinds of movies, and not, all these filmmakers are self-taught, but, Oscar Michaud had a certain amount of experience having made so many films. He was an experienced, capable filmmaker. Hellbound Train is made by a husband and wife, evangelists. So they would tour from town to town, preaching revival services, and had the idea, wouldn't it be effective if we made a movie? And so they made at least 3 films, the biggest of which is Hellbound Train. And so we wanted to have films shot by amateur filmmakers who were, they had this impulse to make film. And to us, that's a piece of history that you're not going to find in any history books. And you're not going to see a movie like that ever released on DVD. A movie that's not even an hour long, and it's shot on the streets with non-actors as they sort of act out these symbolic situations of the devil, driving a train, and then different cars of the train are devoted to different sins. So there's a car for gambling, there's a car for dancing. It's just fascinating. This is such a rare and unusual film, and it's just a delight to be able to, unearth something like that and then share it with the rest of the world.
Absolutely. I remember when I was thinking about it, it was like Dante's Inferno, right? But it's kind of, but it's now, and it's urban. It's a way that people can understand it. But it's interesting you said that, because when I was watching it and I was reading the notes and thinking about, like, these are evangelists, like self-taught filmmakers who are finding a way to market religion. Which is kind of fascinating when you really think about it, and successfully do it, which is the thing.
Yeah. It's funny. I wish that comparison to Dante's Inferno is amazing. It's great because it is, instead of the rings of hell, it's the cars of the train. And, depending on where you are on the train is the degree of sin. So that's, I hadn't thought of that. That's terrific.
Well, I'm here to help. So one of the things that I thought was fascinating, I'd love you to share this story, is about hot biscuits. I thought this was like one of the best anecdotes I'd ever heard. But it's fascinating to think about how history can be lost.
Oh, yeah. Well, and this is a good time to point out that I, going into this project, was no expert on these films, and I acknowledged that. And so that's why it was important to us to have curators who really know these films, know where they are, know which film has to be included. Like, I might have just taken the ones that exist in the best condition, but we had people who would say, no, you've got to find this film. You've got to include this film. And so for this series, it was Charles Musser, who teaches at Yale University, and Jacqueline Stewart, who teaches at University of Chicago. And Jackie is like an academic rock star. She's amazing. She's completely together, has an incredible knowledge of these films. And one of the films she really wanted us to include is called Hot Biscuits. And so she said, it's at the Library of Congress. It's really interesting. You got to find it. And so we went to the Library of Congress and said, can you send us a scan of Hot Biscuits? And they searched their database and they said, no, we don't have a film called Hot Biscuits. Can you confirm? And so she said, no, it's there. Trust me. And so they kept searching, and they said, look, we've searched under Hot, we've searched under Biscuit, we've searched 3 different databases, we've searched paper records. There's no movie here called Hot Biscuits. And then Jackie whips out a cell phone from like 10 years ago. She had gone to the Library of Congress and watched the film and took a picture of the opening titles, and that unraveled the mystery. For comic effect, the word biscuit is spelled Biskit. So it's Hot Biscuits with a K. And as soon as we told the Library of Congress that, they typed it in and said, oh, here it is. It's Hot Biscuits with a K. And if it weren't for her knowing that crucial detail, that film would have not been included. And who knows when anyone would ever have located that film again, because it also wasn't listed under the director's name either. So,
oh, wow.
It's nice when a project like this allows records to be corrected and, films that are on the verge of being lost to being brought back into the light.
That was Bret Wood, director and producer at Kino Lorber, discussing the amazing silent films of African Americans from the Kino Classic Collection, Pioneers in African American Cinema. Up next, we explore women filmmakers from the early 1900s.
And maybe most important of all, women's voices were valued in the 1910s and 20s. They were valued in the film industry. The industry understood that the majority of its audience was female.
That was an excerpt from a panel discussion with Shelley Stamp, the curator of Kino Classics, Pioneers, First Women Filmmakers. This collection is an amazing archive of stories that, just like the African American series, provide texture of America's cultural tapestry. With films from creators like Alice G. Blaché, Lois Weber, Mabel Normand, and Zora Neale Hurston, this collected body of film addresses the climate and issues women faced at the turn of the century. Here is Bret Wood again to discuss Pioneers, First Women Filmmakers. So let's talk about pioneering women. This collection is amazing, first off. And one of the things that we have to talk about is Alice Guy Blaché.
Alice Guy Blaché is the perfect person to start with because, for one thing, she was the first woman to make films in America. But she had actually been making films for, close to 15 years. It's definitely more than 10 years in France. So one of the very first companies to make films in the world was Gaumont. And she was a typist at Gaumont and saw the potential of film not just as a novelty or as an optical device, but to actually tell stories. And so she asked, Gaumont, the owner, if she could write a story. And so he said, as long as you do your day job, yeah, I'll let you write a story. And so she, made one of the first films with a story, and this was in Paris, and it's called The Cabbage Patch Fairy. That's the English translation of the title. And so she made films like fairy tale films. She made sort of mystery films. She made comedies, and this is all like around 1900 or so. And so by the time she gets to America and we begin our first film with her, it's 1911. And she's the first woman to make a film in America, but she already has this huge career of having made hundreds of films, literally hundreds of films in France before she came to America. And these films were anywhere from 30 seconds long to a few minutes. And so that's where we pick her up, is now she's in America and she's starting first working on like an American office for Gaumont, and then she starts her own company called Solax. So not only is she the first first woman to make films in America, she is one of the first filmmakers, period. And she is the first woman to run her own production company.
Oh, wow.
And in fact, while she was still in France before coming to America in the early 1900s, she was the head of production at Gaumont. So she was like, a crucial figure in film history. And so that kind of like starts this collection off and shows that, in the 1910s, women were, it was not unusual for a woman to be making films, writing and directing. And there were a lot of films being made by women in America. It was kind of common. And then over the course of this 6-disc collection, you find fewer and fewer women directing once you get into the 1920s. And then we sort of, by using the films and interviewing historians, sort of explain why that is. What happened to all these women who were making movies in Hollywood and in New York that suddenly stopped in the 1920s.
That's like a cliffhanger that would be in a silent
film.
But to bring up something you were saying about her work, one of the films that I wanted to kind of talk about is A Fool and His Money, specifically because this is a film that has a black cast.
And is not like I mean, it's a comedy, but it's not a comedy that uses excessive caricature. For its comedy, it a little bit to some degree, but at the same time, it's sort of, it's almost like, this is a time when there was no gender bias, and I like to think that there was less racial bias. I mean, we know from, as we talked about earlier, DW Griffith, there was a huge racial bias in, America in the 1910s, no doubt about that. But maybe in the film industry, it was a little more colorblind. So whether that was just her coming from France and having a more European perspective, it's hard to say, but it's still pretty amazing that in 1912, a film is being made with black characters and black actors, no blackface, in which they're, more or less able to be themselves.
Absolutely. And the other thing that she also brought with her is this, this feminism, right? This idea that a woman can take care of herself. And specifically, you see this in the film Suspense, where you have a person in a situation and she does not need a man to help her figure this out.
Yeah. Well, that's the cool thing is that with women writing and directing these movies, then it's almost natural that you would have more strong female characters. And honestly, I think a lot of it is that the studios figured as long as movies are making money, we're not going to get involved in the subject matter so much. So if we've got a woman who makes movies and her movies make money, then she can make a movie about whatever she wants. And so you do get a lot of strong characters, and you have like talented comedians like Mabel Normand. There's a number of Mabel Normand films on this, who was such a popular figure that she directed her own films. And even the films she didn't direct, she got to kind of shape the stories, because with slapstick comedies in the 1910s, there were no real scripts. They would just come up with some situations, take some comedians out to a location and make it funny. And so she had that kind of control. So she would make comedies, and she had almost total control, and she was able to then play around with things like cross-dressing. There's a movie where she pretends to be a male chauffeur, and then the male chauffeur pretends to be her. So that's one of the early cross-dressing comedies that you get. And a lot of the women filmmakers were pushing boundaries in this way, not because they necessarily were challenging authority, but because they had the freedom to make films about what they wanted to make films about. And so you didn't have these narrow guidelines about what is and isn't appropriate for movie entertainment.
Okay.
But similar to Mabel Normand is you have the so-called serial queens. And, serials, just for a refresher to those who have forgotten, every week you would get a new episode of a continuing story. And like you said, there's cliffhangers at the end of every episode. And so some of these serials would last 20 episodes. Some of them would last over 100 episodes. And in the 1910s, most of these were women driven. There were a lot of things about the railroad girl. That would be a big genre. This woman who works for a railroad station and has to walk on the top of a train while it's hurtling down the track. Those were popular, but these women were so popular as actors that, again, they were able to start writing their own scripts and then start directing their own films. And so you got these strong female characters doing very heroic things. We have a number of episodes from a couple of different serials, one called The Purple Mask by a woman named Grace Cunard, and one called The Hazards of Helen, featuring Helen Holmes. And these were women who, went from acting and transitioned to writing and then directing because of the power that they had, earned by being popular box office stars.
As you go through the collection, it's not just, it's not just one thing. And there's themes or concepts that are in how they're organized as well. So, like, for example, you have a section about like social change, and one of the films that is featured is Idle Wives. And I thought that was a really interesting film, and reading the notes about it is a pretty interesting statement to say, right?
Like one of the directors who's probably we have the most films by in the collection is Lois Weber, and she made all sorts of films, but it seems like where she really spoke the loudest is when she's tackling social issues. So she has a film called Hypocrites, which is about hypocrisy in society and about the church. She has a film about gossip, which is called Scandal, also known as The Scandalmongers, where there's like this monster covered with like mud and fur, and it represents gossip. So every now and then when someone gossips, you see this weird werewolf-looking monster walking into the frame. But and she made a film about birth control called Where Are My Children, at a time when it was illegal to distribute information about birth control. And the movie even like sort of suggests abortion in it. There's a scene where they go to a doctor, and even though they can't say the word, we know that's what that doctor does. And Lois Weber's not the only person. There's a woman named Lita Lawrence who made a film called Motherhood, Life's Greatest Miracle. And again, it deals with the idea of birth control and abortion. And when you think about films like that being made, in the 1920s, and it probably wasn't until the 1960s that a movie could show a woman with a pregnant stomach. Because in Hollywood, you would not show a woman's stomach, it just wasn't done. And there were words you didn't use, like abortion, and even pregnant. There's a lot of movies from the 1940s where they won't say the word pregnant. So it's pretty amazing that in the 1920s, women were making films on these topics, which it would be another 40 years before people could return to. And what's really crazy, I know this, when you get the stories behind these films, it's remarkable, and it just shows how much we haven't known about these films. But Lois Weber's film, Where Are My Children, was Universal Studios' #1 film of the year, and it's about birth control.
Wow.
Which is like, and they have pictures of people just like swamping the theater and fighting to get in. And let's see, so it's 1916. So the #1 film that Universal made in 1916 was made by a woman, and it's about birth control. So
I wanted to see if you could talk about the, Zora Neale Hurston's ethnographic films, and it's, her depiction of capturing Black Americana at that time.
Yeah, and the same with Pioneers of African American Cinema. We didn't just want to show Hollywood movies and movies that were made to be shown in theaters. And so there are some like almost homemade films. There's one called That Ice Ticket, which is made by a filmmaker in North Dakota. And there's regional filmmakers. So, we try to show a diversity of filmmakers and not just keep it all centered on feature films made for theaters. And one of the thing I'm proudest to include in this are some of the ethnographic films made by Zora Neale Hurston, which were probably never meant to be seen in a theater and were really only shot as a document, not even as a documentary. I don't think these films were never edited. What happened is she would sort of describe what is in it, and we use those titles for the different segments within the film. So it'll be like children dancing, or baptism, or the crowd at a baseball game of a Negro baseball league. And so those became the titles we used because that's just what she wrote on the can, what she had shot. That nothing was ever edited, and that was never really intended to be shown. It's just she felt a need for someone to show what life was like in the South for African Americans in the late 1920s. So we have those films in Pioneers First Women Filmmakers, and then we also have some films of hers in Pioneers of African American Cinema, where she goes to a logging camp in Florida. So that's what's in that collection. And then in Women Filmmakers collection, we have like things like schools and the baptism, and also there's just shots of someone sitting on their front porch, kind of rocking on their front porch. But it's a thing you will never see in a Hollywood movie. You know, what an average person's life was like, you know, in rural South Carolina or Florida.
Two other movies before we close out. One of the movies I think I wanted to ask you about, which is interesting because as much as, you know, we've talked about African Americans because that is its own collection, but women is so diverse. And one of the films that you have in this film, in this collection, is The Curse of Kwangwan, right? And that's the first, and we're talking about Asian American women.
And that's The Curse of Kwangwan is a really interesting film that a Chinese American woman named Marion Wong made in and around San Francisco in 1916. So this is like really early on, in the middle of the silent era. And it's one of those films where it survives in pretty good condition, but unfortunately there are no title cards. So we don't know exactly what's happening in the story. So rather than kind of make up what we think is happening, we just decided to print it and present it as it exists. And you get a sense of what the story is, but unfortunately we will never know unless some document, you know, turns up exactly what is happening in each of the scenes. But for us, the important thing is get this on the record that an Asian American woman was making films independently in 1916. That's the big takeaway. Yeah, anytime that we could show a film from a different perspective, we tried to include it. And one of those is Salome, which is an amazing movie. I don't know if it's my favorite in the set, but it's pretty darn nuts. Made by a woman named Alla Nazimova. Some people pronounce her name Nazimova. We argued about that. We can't quite figure it out.
That's exactly what I was going to say. So yes.
And it offers, you know, what we perceive as a LGBTQ perspective. Nazimova was believed to be a lesbian, and the people she collaborated with were often gay and lesbian. And so this film has a very heightened sense of drama and makeup and costume, and so she tells this biblical fable is based on the play by Oscar Wilde in a very flamboyant way. And that movie got made in 1923 is pretty amazing, and her career ended shortly thereafter because this was a very expensive production. It was considered this like highbrow piece of art, and audiences of 1923, you know, especially once you get outside the major cities, I don't think they knew what to think of this bizarre. You know, I don't know that they would even recognize it as sort of a gay pageant or a spectacle, but what would they think of this movie in 1923? It's hard to imagine. But again, that's one of those remarkable films that we wanted to include to sort of show that even films by women directors of the 1920s were not all about women's rights. In fact, almost none of them are about women's rights. What they seem to be more about are strong female characters and you know, filmmakers who have a very independent perspective and unique style. So if you watch all 25 hours of films in Pioneer's First Women Filmmakers, and you can find more somewhere, good. And that's what we want, is for you to go out and look for other films like this and see that there's so many more films out there to be discovered. And ultimately, that's what we want, is to create an appetite in people, a curiosity about early films. And quick shout out, I haven't mentioned her yet, Shelley Stamp, who teaches at the University of California at Santa Cruz, was our curator of Pioneer's First Women Filmmakers. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention her, because she knows these films backwards and forwards. She was our primary historical consultant.
I have to thank you so much for, one, participating in this podcast, but also just for what you do. I was so enamored as I started to watch the films and learn more and reading the film notes and understanding more about, who we are as Americans by watching the stories that were told by Americans that were not just white men.
Yeah. Well, I have to thank you because, you're helping me live the dream. I mean, this is what I've always wanted to do. And, by you being a viewer who's curious about these films, by you being a journalist who wants to talk about these films and spread the word, that makes it possible for us to do more.
That again was Bret Wood, director and producer at Kino Lorber, discussing Pioneer's first women filmmakers. You can find out more about silent films we discussed and more by visiting the Kino Lorber website at kinolorber.com. Here you can learn about other classic films, buy the 2 collections we discussed on this podcast and others, and learn more about projects that they may have coming up. And that's our show. Thanks again to Bret Wood for dropping some knowledge about adversity and diversity in early filmmaking. And did you know AFCA recently celebrated the best films of 2018 at our annual AFCA Awards? Visit our website at afca.com or find us on Instagram or Facebook to see photos from the star-studded event. So until next time, keep your head up.